right, good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for coming. Let us know by any chance if you have any problems hearing us, although it sounds great from here. So my name is Elizabeth Schlater, and I'm Deputy Director and Curator of Exhibitions at the University of Richmond Museums. And we're here this evening to enjoy a conversation between two of the artists who are featured in Crooked Data, Tiffany Holmes and Rodenbeck. I'll be moderating the discussion tonight along with Lindsay Ham, who is a senior here at U of R. She's majoring in art conservation. Lindsay helped create the online catalog for Crooked Data. She worked on its design and content, and she also conducted several of the artist interviews. So I'm really pleased she's able to join me this evening. So tonight's conversation was sponsored in part by Data Blueprint. It's a local data management consulting firm. I think we showed a slide earlier with their name and their website, and there's several people here who work at Data Blueprint, and if you want to talk with them about what they do with their company, they'll be happy to talk with you, and we're certainly very grateful for their sponsorship. The talk is part of the university's Geography and the Environment speaker series with support from Environmental Studies program. Additional funding is provided by the university's Cultural Affairs Committee and the Lewis S. Booth Arts Fund. It takes a village to put together an exhibition and related programs, so I want to thank my coworkers in the museums, as well as the staff of the Modlin Center for the Arts, who helps us have events in these wonderful spaces and use the equipment. And I also want to thank the following departments: Art and Art History, Boatwright Memorial Library, the Digital Scholarship Lab, Partners in the Arts, and Recreation and Wellness. And if you're curious as to why we're thinking Recreation and Wellness, which is better known as the gym, we have an artwork in the exhibition that was created by students that's about visitation at the gym. So please make a point of checking that out. There are additional events related to the exhibition coming up this spring semester that are noted online and in our calendar, and I just want to mention two. There's two video festivals in mid-April. The first one is curated by students who were in a fall video and film class taught by Professor Jeremy Drummond. And then the second video festival, which is just a week later, features videos actually made by those same students. So before I turn it over to Lindsay, I just want to remind you that we'll have a reception after this talk, along with the exhibition open for about an hour for you to enjoy as well. So I'm going to turn this over to Lindsay, who will introduce our speakers and provide us with a little information about their artworks.
Hello, good evening. I'll start talking about Tiffany. So Tiffany Holmes is an artist, teacher, administrator, and parent. Her installation work explores the potential of art and design to promote environmental awareness and sensitivity to shifting ecologies on the planet. In addition to her most recent artwork created for Crooked Data, other creative projects include a commission for the National Center for Supercomputing Applications, where sequences of experimental animations visualize real-time energy loads. Her paper detailing this work, Eco-Visualization, Combining Art and Technology to Reduce Energy Consumption, won a Best Paper Award at Creativity and Cognition and a doctoral degree in 2010. Holmes works as the Dean of Undergraduate Studies at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago and is a professor and former chair of the Department of Art and Technology Studies. For the exhibition Crooked Data, Tiffany created the new work titled TNT 170209. This piece is a large data visualization comprised of thousands of broken toy pieces organized into an 8-foot-tall pie chart that denotes species surveyed in the local Richmond National Battlefield Park. The data was gathered in fall 2016 with assistance from UR students working with professors in the departments of biology and geography and the environment. Also joining us tonight is Rodenbeck, the founder and creative director of Stamen Design, a data visualization practice based in San Francisco. Stamen's projects have focused on themes as diverse as climate change, bioinformatics, humanitarian relief, health and medicine trends, and even human emotions, thanks to a fascinating work created with the Dalai Lama. Other prestigious clients have included the World Health Organization, National Geographic, Toyota, and the University of Richmond's Digital Scholarship Lab, which worked with Stamen on the American Panorama, a project funded by the Mellon Foundation that uses maps to reveal and illustrate the history of the United States using large data sets. Recent topics have included redlining in the New Deal America, foreign-born population trends since 1850 through 2010, and the development of overland trails to the American West during the mid-19th century. In Crooked Data, stamen design is represented by 3 dynamic visualizations, jointly titled Facebook Flowers. The visualizations diagram the viral activity following 3 Facebook image postings originally shared by Star Trek actor George Takei. The posted images were of Marvin the Martian, Ab Fab London, and Famous Failures. The emerging patterns resemble living organisms like plants or algae, a theme that stamen design notes is common in visualizing large and complex data sets. To get our discussion started this evening, I'll ask the first question. Tiffany, in the mid-2000s, you coined the term eco-visualization to refer to artworks that reinterpret environmental data with custom software to promote stewardship. Could you explain how and why you came up with that term? Does your artwork and Crooked Data fit within the definition of this term?
Thanks for the question, Lindsay. In 2004, it seems so long ago, I was working on a PhD dissertation. I was completing it at the University of Plymouth in the UK. At the time, that was one of the few places that a studio artist, could do a studio art-related dissertation. So I was meeting 3 times a year with my advisors. I was a part-time student, and I had an amazing group of peers. A lot of them were Americans working in the university system who were also interested in writing as an extension of their practice. So I can talk about those artists in a minute, but we were really being encouraged in our discussion groups to think of words that would actually help define and extend our field. And at the time that I was doing my literature review for the dissertation, I was looking into all of these amazing artists and designers who were using data to make specific commentary about climate change. So one example is the artist Eve Mosher. She's based in New York. She was working with a simple piece of technology, a machine that chalks football fields. And she had taken the sort of latest climate model data that showed where sea level would be on the island of Manhattan in the year 2050. And she took her chalk machine and pushed it literally around the island of Manhattan, drawing that line. So it was really an expanded drawing experiment, but I loved the piece so much because it really dealt with the things that I'm interested in, how you promote human interaction through art. She met so many people in these neighborhoods when she was pushing these chalk machines. I got to interview her later for the dissertation, so that was one piece that had a significant effect on this word. And then also, I was in touch with a Swedish design group called Static, and they were doing such cool things in the early 2000s. They had a light fixture that would bloom, almost like one of Eric's flowers. It would bloom in the household when energy usage was very low. So you got the reward when all the lights in the house were off, the dishwasher was off, et cetera. Really wonderful devices that would enhance the home environment if the family was using or consuming less energy. So I was thinking about all these works collectively, and I was using with my students, with my peers in this PhD group, the term eco-visualization so much that actually finally my husband said, you should really write that down and put it in your paper. And I published an article with it. I think that paper you cited in my bio. And then Google Scholars was started to be used more and more, and then a bunch of other researchers used the word, and it took off. And then the question about the piece, I'm an artist, so I use these terms rather loosely. So I do think that the work in the show, can I back it up? Yeah. The toy piece, I mean, it is based on a pie chart, and I worked with a biologist who's based at the University of Richmond here, Dr. Todd Lookingbill, and he provided the data through an app called iNaturalist that really looked at the biota in the natural world that is literally outside the gallery. And I think for me, even though the piece is physical, and we can talk about that later, it's made of all of these recycled toys that I got from over 100 Chicago households with frustrated moms like myself who just wanted this stuff outside their house. we reclaimed it and made something beautiful about it, but it also is kind of a commentary on this synthetic world that we all live in. But I love that it's juxtaposed with this very real data set that maps out the flora and fauna of the Richmond area. So in that sense, it is an eco-visualization, but it's not dynamic. So I will say that in the way that some of Eric's works are really dynamic. So maybe that's a nice segue.
So we were going to ask you, Eric, if you had some works. I'm not necessarily sure if Facebook Flowers fits within this eco-visualization definition that you've heard, but I know there's a lot of other projects that you've done that are related to the environment and sustainability. And if you wanted to talk about some of those, and if you thought they might fit within this coined rubric of eco-visualization.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a number of, it's funny, this makes me feel old, but if you do 40 projects a year, eventually, and you do that for 10 years, eventually you have you can kind of slice through your work in all these different ways. And so one of them is definitely eco in the sense of mapping the natural environment. We've done a number of maps that are about sea level rise. I think maybe this is the one that's the most closely related to what you're describing. There's one that artist that you were talking about, Eve, could have used as a kind of outline for where those things are, because you can see where the coastline of New York will be under 1 foot of water, 10 feet of water. And I just remember when we made the visualization of New York under 10 feet of water, it seemed so outrageous, 10 feet. And then it turned out to map almost one-to-one with what happened when Sandy hit. It was kind of this, you could tell where those places were. So, we've done a number of those, but I would also, I guess the way I think about it is eco isn't just like polar bears. Eco is all the other stuff. We've recently gotten involved with the chance to map the microbiome, which is a thing that I hadn't heard about before anybody showed up at the shop. And what they're doing is, rather than kind of taking a genetic sample and then probing at it and finding out what it does, the researchers at the Banfield's lab are swabbing environments in the world. So they'll do things like look at the difference between a killer whale mouth and a dolphin mouth, which are radically different genetic environments, but then also things like the bacteria that grow on the inside of leach fields in South African coal mines or gold mines that are covered in cyanide. And there's creatures that live in there. So they swipe those as samples, a very basic process, but then break apart all of the DNA of all of the organisms that are in that sample that are all working together to live in these extreme environments, and then basically break all that apart into the DNA samples and then use math to stitch it all together so that you get this complex set of interrelationships of all of the different organisms that live inside these environments. So it's not about saving the whales necessarily, but it's about the premise is that these tools can then be used by researchers in their labs to do things like grow cultures that can be used to start to remediate those kinds of environments. So imagine if you could just go into one of these kind of horrible oil fields or a set of radioactive waste fields and pour goop onto it, and it would eat all the radioactive waste. That's the vision.
Go ahead. I was just going to ask about how do you conceive addressing topics like the environment and sustainability in ways that leverage your materials and techniques and provide a different or novel perspective?
So before I got interested in purging all these toys out of my house and others, my other big project I worked on before this, and I think it's interesting, when I started working with computer technology, I don't know if it was like this for you, but back in 1998, doing an interactive media installation was so cool. I mean, it was amazing to be able to move and have a projection respond, to make a sound and have something come back at you. It was really new then. Today, it's in every children's museum that you go to. It's not as novel. That kind of responsive technology is not as exciting. So I feel like so many of the artists that I was exhibiting with in the 90s, all of our practices have radically changed. Strangely, a lot of my colleagues are now doing responsive pieces that are not interactive with humans, but respond to data dynamics or data change. And some of the projects that you're doing, I think I went a different direction, and I have, as Lindsay mentioned, I have a full-time job as a dean, and I'm really interested in education and pedagogy. When I graduated, I don't know how many students are in the audience, but when I graduated from college, I had no idea what I was going to do. I was an art history major. My parents didn't want me to be an art major because they thought there weren't too many jobs in that, but boy, art history major. There were opportunities for sure, but it seemed like the path was leading direct to graduate school, and I didn't really want to do that. So I joined a program called Teach for America, and I found myself as a 4th grade teacher. I thought I was going to be an art teacher, but Jesse Holmes had cut a lot of the art funding at that time, and I was a 4th grade teacher. So I say this because I think one's early path to how you get to these kinds of things affect who you are. So when I had this full-time job, I had like, how am I going to be creative? What's my creative outlet? What am I going to do? I started working with solar toy kits. I don't know if anybody's ever played with them. Peppy Orangutan is one of my favorite solar toy kits, the little monkey that the arms go like this. But I held all of these wonderful workshops at different art events, symposia, et cetera, but they were highly participatory, and it was so magical to see people who came to these workshops. They were multi-generational. The magic of solar energy, to see sunlight hit the cell and have this movement happen was like magic for even the oldest adult in the room. And so much of what's happened with the history of renewables in our country is so buried. And I think it's really important, and one of the real roles of art, even on a small scale, can help open people's eyes to how the wonder of certain technologies could actually really powerfully impact us now, today. And so these solar toy workshops really opened my eyes as to how the medium really could provide a lot of the message and synthesize what I was trying to do as an artist and as an educator and as a teacher. I imagine you've had similar experiences, though.
Can I ask you something?
Mm-hmm.
It used to be when I would make something, whatever, some experimental piece, or I'd go and visualize taxi cabs, or I'd just try and do something really wild and outlandish on the internet, or in a gallery. It seemed that there was a period of a year, 6 months, some amount of time greater than a week that it could kind of be its own kind of weird idea, and then something would happen and it would get commercialized. And that gap has shrunk for me like so dramatically that I'm
small.
like, so it's either that I'm getting old and boring, which is possible, probable, in fact. But I think also that there's a kind of, there's two sides to that, right? There's that things are moving faster and that just happens to everybody. But then also that the market is kind of ready to accept really weird ideas now.
Mm-hmm.
The stuff that's happening is so crazy and strange and so science fiction-y. It's like, I get vertigo. That's my main emotion right now is vertigo. It's like, oh, of course, there's a robot suitcase following a dude around in the airport. Like, of course, and of course there's a huge industry behind it. And of course there's an app where they can take my stuff and chop it up into little increments and I can just have it anytime I want it for $0.25 a month. Like, that makes sense.
Are you kind of getting at like a loss of wonder?
Oh, yeah, maybe that would be the sad way to say it. I think it's also an increase of wonder of just like, are you kidding me? Like, of course, I don't mean to be contrary. I just mean like there's all this just amazing stuff. It's just explosion. I remember I was reading about Darwin and that he lived in a time of just massive innovation and all this new stuff happened. They would just discover dinosaurs and all that Victorian stuff and new forms of coal and all that kind of stuff. I feel like we're in a similar kind of just explosive time of just like rapid, just crazy, So I'm not sure what the question was, except that the thing keeps collapsing, I guess. It's like the weird stuff. The weird stuff is, but things used to be alternative, and now I don't feel like they are. It's just, somebody invents it, and then suddenly there's a robot following me around.
Yeah, I remember, I don't know if you remember this piece by Mark Napier. It was called The Shredder. It was one of the first sort of web-based art pieces I saw.
I know Mark.
So you would put in a browser your website, tiffanyholmes.com or whatever. And I thought this was amazing when I saw it. And so Mark's app, this was before the whole term app development became household language, His app shredded up your website, brought the underlining HTML, including the links and the images, and literally shredded it up into sort of a collage on the screen and played with text sizes and so forth. It made it a collage, a really beautiful cut-up piece.
Yeah.
And it was so exciting to so many of our even my students who I showed it to, because it was a way of seeing your stuff differently. But there are hundreds of apps now that let you see your stuff differently, from Flickr to all of the other cooler ones. I mean, the sense of ownership over one's data has never been available in so many different varieties, I think. And yet at the same time, we are also giving our data sort of willingly away to different entities, interests, Facebook, for example, who are needing it for other purposes, I'll say. But I think this question of novelty is really interesting to me, because I feel like Mark's piece, The Shredder, was pretty novel for about 6 to 8 months. But novelty now is maybe 1 week. You know, what's in your feed, what's on GitHub, what's, you know.
It's the kids today, I think. No patience, no respect. No, but I mean, yeah, I definitely feel that, but I think it's, I mean, I'm also aging into it where like my opportunities for having novel thoughts are shrinking in some ways. But yeah, it definitely does seem that way, that there's, the space of specifically of digital was a bit more wide open, right? What else did Mark do? He's so great. I mean, that stuff really made a huge impression.
He's so amazing. I think he's still associated with Bitform's gallery. If you look at Steve Sachs's gallery up in New York, which was one of the first galleries that really featured new media work to some extent. He's done a lot of data-based works in the past, and I always remember him with the Shredder, though. That's to me the ultimate piece.
I guess my next question would be, community engagement and involvement seems prevalent in both of your practices. This includes working with communities to inform your work as well as assist sometimes in its execution. Eric, you've been involved in your local community, such as your work in the Tenderloin neighborhood of San Francisco. While Tiffany, your piece in Crooked, you collected all the materials locally and sought to hear people's stories involving these materials. How did this community involvement become important to you, and how do you see it as an educational tool as well as an integral part of your artistic process?
So this is, I think, another thing that's changed for me quite dramatically in the last 5 to 10 years. We could talk about the Tenderloin too, but I think it might be more interesting to start with the community of volunteers that makes OpenStreetMap, which is the kind of Wikipedia for mapping. It says, if you think about Wikipedia, just how it's got, you know, obsessive things about anime, but nothing about, you know, famous people, or, you know, that it's varied and spotty. It's like that. You know, it's mapping the whole world, and it's kind of amazing. And it started out of this kind of British pub culture where people would get together, you know, in London bars and map their different neighborhoods, and now it's just exploded to become this worldwide phenomena. And we use that data all the time in our mapping projects, like partially because it's free. I mean, that's the huge part of it. It's just like, you know, you can just, I mean, it comes with a bunch of onerous labeling restrictions and reuse and that kind of stuff, but you can just, as somebody with no budget who just wants to make something, you don't have to sign up for anything, and there's very little training involved, and you can just use it. And it's basically all hand done by communities of volunteers. There's kind of restrictions in place against kind of massive importing of commercial data sets. So every building you see on OpenStreetMap, somebody's drawn by hand. Every road, somebody's done by hand. And that's cool, right? I mean, it means that we can make maps of the world, you know, effectively for free, based entirely on community input with no commercial anything. And just the fact that that's even plausible is kind of astonishing. I mean, and just this whole idea that that a community of dedicated volunteers, by, you know, being relentless about what they're doing, can map the entire Earth is just extraordinary. Would have been unthinkable. You know, when it started, people were laughing at them. Now it's one of the most respected projects online. But there's an inflection point that's starting to happen, I think, in the way that those communities are being perceived, because of for a number of different reasons, but part of it is that you just have to let everybody in if you're going to do a worldwide project like that, and you can't have just the senior people take control because they've been sitting at the bar the longest, you know? But then also there's this kind of machine learning thing that's just completely steamrolling so many amazing things, and there's, you know, there's Facebook, there's people at Facebook, so Facebook has as their mission to connect the whole world, and one of the places, they're interested in a lot of places in the world where there's not a lot of connectivity because they'd like to bring connectivity there so that they can increase their market share. So in order to do that, you need to figure out where the people live, and in order to do that in a place like Kenya, where there aren't necessarily like, you know, comprehensive population survey studies, you start to look at data from space. And so they're developing algorithms to be able to detect population centers from space algorithmically and automatedly so that they can then build maps of where the people actually are. And perhaps not coincidentally, now they've got a data set of all of the building footprints in Kenya. So they're trying to figure out what to do with it, so they'd like to put it into OpenStreetMap. And so this kind of crowd bottom-up network is now, I wouldn't say it's being challenged by the rise of the machines, but it's definitely now like, in the same way as it was completely unfeasible to think that a core group of volunteers could map every building in the world, it's now becoming very feasible to think that a group of machines by Facebook could incidentally create a map of all the infrastructure in the world. And I don't know what that does for community. I have no idea. Does that make sense? It's kind of like, it's just, you know, these things that we thought that the internet is this kind of amazing, liberative, explosive, community-oriented force that lets people, you know, in India can connect with people in London and they can talk to us and everything, and then, but it changes when, I don't know, the scale of the machine learning is really going to impact that in ways that I think it's hard to predict.
I mean, I do think that, again, 10 years ago, crowdsourced projects were just at the beginning, I feel like. One that's been around for many years is the SETI group. You set up your computer to help look for artificial life in other cosmos. But there are now hundreds of them, and they're all doing pretty amazing things, I would say. I think in my work, I feel like I love being online, and I admire these works greatly, but I miss face-to-face contact. And I spend so much of my workday online, sort of a slave to email and other kinds of things, that in my creative life, I'm favoring more of a face-to-face kind of communication. So when I was working on this TMT piece, I had this kind of moment where after Thanksgiving, I had my kids, I have a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old, and I think they had both just been to a birthday party and literally brought back a huge bag of party favors that were all this plastic stuff with maybe a pencil and an eraser, and it was immediately going to go into my trash can. So I just thought, I'm going to write this letter to my elementary school community, tell them about this piece that I'm working on for Crooked Data, and just see if people will do a purge of their house before the December holidays, and I'll just see what I get. I had tons of stuff in my basement, but I got all these parents involved, parents who I didn't really know that well, who weren't in my social network, who were so excited to actually talk about this. And then I sent out another email saying, hey, I don't know what I'm going to do with this stuff, but can you just put in a note with your toys so I know who it's from, and tell me a little bit about what your collection process was like. Did you involve your kids? Did you not? Did you sort of do this at midnight so no one would see what you were throwing out? And how did you do it? And I got, so the secretary at my kids' school would take these bags from parents or from kids and put them under her desk, and she would text or email me when she had something for me to pick up. So day 2, she's like, I have so much stuff for you, you gotta get in here and get it. So clearly people have this on their minds, this whole notion of how much we're consuming, how much stuff we have in our houses. And I started unpacking the toys, and I had these beautiful, some very poetic notes from moms and dads saying, one mom was a newly divorced mom who's pretty depressed, and she just said, I just want this stuff out of my house. I don't have time to clean, you know. And then another woman wrote me this missive talking about how she and her husband, who's an architect, were so sick of these McDonald's Happy Meal toys that when they were rebuilding their basement stairs, they left an opening in the wall and between the drywall, and they had their boys drop the McDonald's toys into the opening. And when it was filled up, and they did fill up an entire 2 floors of it apparently, they sealed it up and it's there in the house for the next owners. So I loved getting all of these mini short stories about these toys that nobody wanted. And I don't know what I'm going to do with them yet. I think they would make a great book. But I do feel very connected to the community of people who donated these items. And I sent the pictures around. You know, this is the first time I've seen the show. I'm very grateful to the preparator who helped put all these things up. It's really exciting for me to see in person, and I'm excited to go back and email the school close-ups so they can find their things in this artwork.
I was going to say, I hope you won't, so my coworker, Stephen, put this up. Do you mind if or do you want to tell about?
I can, yeah, this is another, so.
Hopefully he won't mind.
Is Stephen here?
You might be in the gallery.
Okay. So this is a hilarious story. So I was in New York at the College Art Association conference. I think you were there too, and maybe it was right before I was leaving. But Elizabeth had sent me a note that they had run out of blue for the design. And I said, you know, no problem. She sent me a picture. There was this nice blue hole in the piece. And I said, that's no problem. I have so much blue. Let me just throw some nails on stuff and I'll ship it out. And Elizabeth said, you know, Stephen, the preparator who's been working on your piece, has a little girl, and he's pretty confident he has a lot of blue plastic at home. And he's volunteered to purge some things and make this happen. So I feel really excited that even in terms of the community involvement here in Richmond, people got involved in donating their stuff to the piece, which I feel really excited about.
Yeah, he had plenty the next day. Which any of us who are parents have experience with that. Let me ask about, so both your pieces are based on concrete data, but they're not specifically readable in the sense that when you look at the pieces, you don't see automatically, this is what this, or these shapes represent this kind of data. You can't necessarily get the numbers or the figures. Actually, I'll switch over to an image of one of your works, Eric. With Eric, you use aesthetics, these flower forms, and then you use toys to suggest larger themes. You kind of render this individual data somewhat inaccessible without additional information that the visitor has to read or look up or see in some of the additional materials. So I guess the question is, when you create works like this, do you ever feel, sort of a three-dimensional tug-of-war between fidelity to the data that you're working with, between your creative license in the piece that you design or you make, as well as the accessibility of the viewer?
Yes.
Yeah.
So the other thing to say then would be that the idea that there is a 100% accessible method of representation that is a purely neutral display of completely unbiased data in the service of a rational viewer, I haven't seen, right? So I don't know what that would be. I mean, I guess a pie chart. I mean, except maybe not with that pie chart. Or with your pie charts, I guess. And we were talking about this earlier today, I would never say that it's all subjective. I mean, there's certainly truth and fidelity and all those kinds of things. For me, the interesting conversation to have is, what kinds of conversations can we have about the ways that this data is represented, and what kinds of opportunities does it afford us to have a conversation about the world that's not just everything's a lie, or this is perfectly true, if that makes any sense, right? I mean, it's real data, right? It is actually a number of Facebook shares. Actually, the next one is a little bit easier to read. Thank you.
The blue one?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
If it's not clear what these are explosions where George Takei is at the center, and he shares a picture of Marvin the Martian, I think it was the picture of the first image from the Martian rover, with Marvin the Martian kind of sticking down over it, and of course the internet goes crazy. But it goes crazy in this very specific way. And this particular one, George is at the center, and there's a little explosion where, he's got millions of followers and they all immediately tweet, or they all immediately share right away. But then those kind of long chains that come off of them are kind of successive chains of people, I share it to you, you share it to her, you share it to her, and then it kind of goes around. So there's this kind of like, and then if you watch the piece moving, sort of towards the end of some of these pieces, there's another sort of set of explosions where, maybe it goes from me to you to George to then, and then maybe, Dennis Rodman tweets it, and then suddenly there's this whole other thing, or whoever, it doesn't even matter. So just this idea that there's a kind of specific arc and shape to the ways in which these things get propagated, almost like a mycelium from, a mushroom underneath it, or, you can sort of play with those kinds of ideas. So, to me, this one is quite different than this one, right? I mean, this one just there's a whole different set. I mean, it's the same data in the sense of, but this one was, the reason that this one's all full is because it was shared in a fundamentally different way than this one, right? This one was shared by networks of chains of people all going through, and this one was kind of a much more broadly based, kind of diffuse, like multi-explosional kind of situation. So this idea that there's visual ways of expressing things that can't necessarily be necessarily immediately discovered through words is really what I'm after. So and it's less about, women in Thailand like this photograph less than, men in Greenland on the weekend. Like that's, I mean, you can do that and that's important, and there's plenty of data scientists that do that, but this idea that Facebook has a kind of almost intuitive and physical is the wrong word, but that there is a shape to the way these things move through the network, and that we can consider the network as a kind of medium that things move through, and there's specific affordances of it. I think there's value in talking about that just as much as there is in talking about the dry kind of ROI, see if you can get people to click on stuff. I just feel like this is too important to leave to the IT staff.
So Eric, in this piece, if I'm interpreting it, are there more shares in this piece because of the multi-flower blossoms?
Yep.
But in this piece, it's viral. It's clear that it's viral, but there are maybe very distinct modalities of the way that image was transferred.
Yeah, and I think what I'd respond to there is that there's different ways of being viral, right? Like this one is being viral by being passed along to many actors in a network, whereas and so is the other, but this one is being viral by it's passing through. It's passing through chains of interrelated people. It's not just so broadly diffuse. Mm-hmm. We're doing a study now with the University of Chicago about social networks in poor neighborhoods in Chicago. And it turns out that, so they went and interviewed, the church and the community center and the rec center and the, organic food store. And it turns out that in those different neighborhoods, there's different kinds of networks of those kinds of social groups. And I feel like I might not have thought about the best ways to represent that in a very, kind of clear way if I hadn't played with it this way, right? And I think I think it's interesting to think of those things as the same kind of thing. Not that one of them is art over here and the other one is analysis over here, but that there is commonality between them and they can learn from each other.
I think what you say is really interesting because it's something we talk to students about all the time, that whatever your medium is, I mean, it's data viz in this case, you kind of have to be able to iterate and play with it a bit to understand the tool or the algorithm or whatever it is that you're using in that instance. And often the first solution is not the end solution. And I think this is really what artists and designers can bring to the field, in the sense that I get the impression you feel this way too, that I don't ever feel a real didactic need to tell the whole story. In these kinds of events, you can tell more than what a viewer might get in a gallery or something, and that's the reward of coming to an event like this. But I think it's really hard, for artists who use data, for artists that do crowdsource kinds of things, is what do you put on the gallery wall exactly? How do you guide your audience enough but not make it hard for them or make them feel sleepy from being in the gallery because they have to read so much? It's really hard. And I think, in this sort of political moment, obviously we all want to tell the truth, but it's important as artists to reserve, I would say, our more shamanistic tendencies to be able to play and to be able to play with data, try out things, experiment. I think scientists actually have a much harder job because they have to publish and fact find. And for me, that's the real reward of being an artist, is that we're not kind of held to those standards. And it allows you to iterate and experiment in sometimes using the same methodologies as scientists, but you're not held to the same rules, if that makes sense.
I'm doing a seminar next week at UC Berkeley on things that scientists can learn from Pixar, which I'm looking forward to. I don't really quite know how it's going to go, but I don't know whether it's going to work or not, but it'll be interesting regardless.
It's next week?
I think so, yeah. Sorry.
Wow.
Can I just talk about this piece for a second that I saw that you made me think of this, of this kind of idea of play, like the piece that takes the Bible and Stephen Hawking's work and cuts it into these insanely small pieces of paper, and then like
right.
he's got, and the artist, I don't know,
Martin Bree.
Martin Reed,
Yeah.
like wrote like.
Do you want to put it up? Or?
Yeah, I'll see if I can.
I was astonished by that, I have to say. Like just that really, I mean, I think that it's a really good show. I'm really proud to be involved in it. But that, just in terms of play, like I would never do that. I would never. Like, yeah, like each one of those, I mean, is like 3 millimeters high and has those words. It's like completely crazy. I don't know how that's done, but this idea that, I mean, it must have been playful. It must have had some fun with
Yeah, so it's several chapters from Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time. And all the words are represented on these teeny weeny little tiles. And then he matched up the words with if the word showed up in the Bible, in the Quran, and oh gosh, I'm missing the third holy text. But if they show up in all three,
Torah.
the Torah.
Yeah.
If they show up on all three, they're gold. If they show up in two, they're silver. If they show up in one, it's bronze. And if the word shows up in none of those, then it's copper.
I mean, can you imagine doing that by hand? I mean, that was fun.
Yeah, and we only have three. He has the entire book created, but we only chose three to show. And they're on that beautiful, thin paper, and they kind of pop out from the walls.
I mean, if I made something like that, I would never, ever let anybody hang it in a gallery. Someone's going to come up and be like...
Honestly, I think he offered to FedEx it to us. And I was like, no, we have to use an art shipper because if this thing gets destroyed, you can't, take the time to put that back together. So.
But it made me think of play just in the sense of like he's clearly crazy. Or there's some kind of, there's clearly some sort of impulse behind this that's beyond, I don't mean to say anything disrespectful. I just mean that it's just this, it's a really remarkable feat. And it's not even that I'm impressed because it's hard, I'm just impressed because it's so weird.
Yeah. Well, we've got a little bit of time if people in the audience have some questions for our artists. Yeah.
So I'm wondering if you think that data visualization of art has any role in the open data conversation. Meaning, there are so many open APIs now, right? And you gather data in so many different kinds of ways. Do you think that this kind of visualization in this kind of public way either makes people more likely to join in that sort of open data movement, or actually deters them from doing something like that because they feel like they lose some control over how the data speaks? Or would you, and maybe that last statement that I made is somewhat provocative, do you feel like the data that's gathered actually does, that whoever gathered it maybe loses some of their ability to interpret that in a particular way?
Amazing.
I think your question could be interpreted in multiple ways, but I feel like because I work with so many art and design students who are paying an incredibly high cost for their education, they don't have a lot of what I would call excess spendable cash around. The open data movement, or just whatever, the open source movement, just generally speaking, has really been transformative to them and their educations. And the whole notion of, it takes a village or sharing makes a better piece. I mean, they really believe that. And in a really wonderful and somewhat utopian way that is really exciting to see as someone who maybe is old now. And it's
okay. We're gonna be
I mean,
fine.
I feel that all the time. The students, I look at them, they get younger and younger and younger, and they're cynical about so many things, but they are really idealistic about sharing of data, the kind of open source things that they're doing with each other. And just a short example of this that might bring this more to life. I have worked, as an art and design school, we don't have an engineering program, so we partnered with Northwestern, and we have a class that I used to run called Collaborative Data Viz. It takes 2 faculty from our school, 2 faculty from Northwestern, 10 artists, and 10 engineering students. We bring them together, and the faculty present what I would call sanitized data sets, meaning data sets that have been kind of cleaned up to make sense. And so there was one scientist who was he's a chemical engineer, but actually a lot of his research right now is on school choice in Chicago. And the students were really fascinated by this data set, but they couldn't make it do something on its own. It wasn't interesting. They couldn't figure out what to do. So we told them, go to the City of Chicago's website, see what's available for free. And they ended up using public transit data and the school choice data to show that because of public transit times in the city of Chicago, many, many, many students chose worse performing schools for their high school because they were easier to get to. So the students ended up doing this 3D sort of laser cut map of the city of Chicago where the Loop, which is where the downtown is like this pit because everything is really easy to get to. But if you go out to the far west side, there's like this mountain, and Chicago's very flat, so this whole thing was very comic to all of us there. But it really illustrated visually some of the challenges that a high school student living on the far west side or the far south side might have, even if they had really great grades and were admitted to a school on the far north side that had a great academic reputation. So it's just a small example, and I love to see our students who, working together with these completely different students make something that was really meaningful. They actually ended up getting a small write-up in Scientific American for their piece on the blog, so we were all so proud of them. But I think it's a good thing, to answer your question.
I think it's a great question. I think, when open source and open data and kind of free data kind of came online, I think there was this idea, to quote a line from the Simpsons, that like step 1 is get the data, and then step 3 is profit, whereas in this case step 3 is like, and then the world is great, we're going to take all the crime data, and I was guilty of this as anybody, we're going to take all the crime data from the city of Oakland, city of San Francisco, and we're going to put it on a map, and we're going to be able to prove definitively that the only time that the police make prostitution arrests is from 2 to 4 on International Boulevard, and they pick people up as they go, and then on Thursday you're totally scot-free and you don't have to worry about it, right? And we did that, and nothing changed, some things changed, and there were more substantive conversations with the police as a result, and that was really good. But I think this idea that you could go straight from like closed data, proprietary systems, corruption, to open data, open systems, free software, utopia was. Maybe we needed to think about that a little bit more, So that I think the sort of shift has happened, and I think you're probably seeing it too. That everybody that does a certain kind of work is just expecting that they won't have to pay for any of the software and that the data will be available, which is kind of radical, But then the other piece of it is that free data and free speech. It's like it's not free like free speech. It's free like free speech, not free like free beer. There's still work that has to happen, and just because you have a data set doesn't mean anything, and just because you have the software doesn't mean anything. So I think it doesn't, I think what I used to think was that the shift was, I think I said this already, like, proprietary software, proprietary data, locked systems, a lack of transparency, and now we've got, open source, open data, free software, and a lack of transparency, right? It's just the three kind of, just because it's free and open doesn't mean doesn't mean that the change that you want to see as a result of that shift actually happens in the world, right? So if anything, I would agree with you that it's a good thing. I also feel like it's on us now to do something with it. It's not just about releasing it and then going back and doing things the way that we did before.
And just one other short story follow-up. The other thing is that there's this thing that free data is really accessible and easy to read, and there are all kinds of problems with it too, because it's not been cleaned up the way a scientist might clean up their data set to run their algorithm. And I think government data is especially, there's tons of it. There's tons of it that's open access, but who bothers to read all of that? I have a former student who's an art star now. It's so exciting. His name is Trevor Paglin. He shows at Metro Pictures. I don't know if you know his work, but he really made a name for himself writing this book on secret prisons. And he found all of the data by going through hundreds of thousands of flight manifests that are available from the US governments to find planes that never landed, basically. And that was sort of provided some evidence that planes were taking off from Guantanamo or other places and maybe transferring individuals to black sites. And he's done a lot of work in this area, and he's gained quite a reputation for it. And I really admire him. As an artist, he went from art school and got a geography degree at University of California, Berkeley, and really merged his creative with his research interests. But it took years for him to sift through public record data to find the material for his work. I mean, and that takes an amazing amount of passion and commitment.
He's amazing. That work is fantastic. The other thing that I would add to that then is I'm and Stamen are starting to think about this as the next thing that, I don't know what about you all, but after the election I sort of realized I could give $100 to the ACLU all I wanted to, but I needed to do something a little bit more and get the studio involved. So we're starting to think about redistricting and gerrymandering and the kind of composition of the different political districts that make up the United States. And it's one of the reasons that the political landscape is what it is now is because it's been carved up in these kind of really, I wouldn't say corrupt ways, but it's definitely not a nonpartisan, fair, right? And it's complex. And to be fair, there's voting rights issues, and there's minority access issues. You can't break up certain ethnic groups and minority groups and stuff like that. But the process is not transparent at all, and it's just not clear why the districts are laid out the way that they are, and it's just not clear what the change is going to be and how it's going to work, and it's all just complex. So we're starting to do some work there. But it's a huge task. I mean, to sift through
to build models of districts and
to build models of, I mean, some of the stuff is like fairly well understood, but the history certainly is not, and then correlating that in any kind of meaningful way with the demographics of that area and then the politics of that area and how you want it to shift and all those kinds of things. So, and the trouble is that there's no money in it, right? And so it's kind of this thing that it's only ever controlled by the people who are local. So we're starting to put a coalition of people together to do that work. But I guess I'm echoing what you said while plugging my redistricting interest it's just hard. It's a lot of work. It's a big, it's a big country. There's a lot of secret planes.
I had someone say once that when someone says it offers you free software, it's kind of like they're saying, here, it's a free puppy.
Right.
So it's,
Totally.
it's free, but there's
That's
a
good.
catch. Okay, so we have time for maybe one more quick question, if somebody has, yeah.
So when it comes to like traditional data representation, there's such a press for us, like in scholarly papers and such, to really be objective and let the data speak for itself. Well, when it comes to more creative pursuits, it's accepted and even expected sometimes that we put a lot of personal bias into what we show in that work. I'm just really interested in how you guys kind of reconcile that, where kind of does that line fall for each of you on how much bias should we put into it to represent what you're trying to say creatively, and how much do you find it necessary to really be completely objective with the data? Or is it okay to kind of put your bias in to try and represent what you think this data is truly saying?
So I should be clear that the work that we showed here is,
Do you want me to put up your website or?
no, people can find it, is by far some of the least objective work that we've done. Like we have a wide spectrum of things, and the work we did with the Digital Scholarship Lab which I'm very proud of, is much more on the less biased. Would you say? Is it? It's definitely not as kooky as that stuff. You know, it's much more about slave trade and foreign-born populations and that kind of stuff. And for me, the key to being creative in an academic environment is you got to do a couple things. One of them is you have to cite your sources, absolutely, and then the second is you have to make it as easy as possible for people to get to the specific piece of it that they want so that they can talk about it and cite it and be, so for the DSL project, every one of the states of the project has its own distinct, unique URL. So you can say, you know, this county, this year, this slave population, you know, just to be very crisp about it. So I definitely get that the Academy encourages a certain kind of critical thinking. I think it's vital. I also feel like you can get away with a lot if you're very upfront about what those specific biases are and what those specific data sets are. If you're clear about that, and it's not even to say that you can get away with a lot, it's just you can say, well, this is, I'll give you an example, right? So, and I don't mean to hog, but so for the work that we did with the Digital Scholarship Lab, Rob and his team looked at all the counties of the United States when we had American slaves, enslaved Americans, I should say. And they looked at the population records of all those places, and they looked at the number of slaves that should have been in those places if none of the slaves had moved from place to place, and then compared that with who was actually there. So some places, there should have been a lot of slaves and there weren't. And some places, there was no reason for slaves to have been naturally born there, and there were a lot of them. And so from that, they created these models where you could see that the eastern parts of the country became primarily slave exporters, and some parts of the country became slave importers. Now, there's no census records, there's very few records of a specific enslaved person going from one place to another, from one place to a census, in one place being forcibly removed and then brought to another place. I mean, there's a couple that's sporadic, but it's not like that was systematically tracked or anything like that. But these, I would call them data scientists, like went through and did all that estimation. And it's not just as simple as like, county A in one year and county B in another year. There's, this is part of the gerrymandering and redistricting, is that county borders, which are the source of truth for the census, change all the time, and they split up, and especially as the country is growing, and right, so you can't just make a one-to-one comparison between Jackson, Mississippi in 1860 and 1810, right? So they went through and they actually carved it all up and they ran all this statistical modeling on it, and that stuff is all a matter of public record. But it's an estimate. I mean, we don't know exactly how many slaves were moved from one place to another, but but I think, and I don't want to misrepresent you guys' work, but there's a caveat that like this is a model. And it's a model based on real data, but it's not a specific, and sort of by calling it that model, it let them do the work. Like you couldn't do that work otherwise, and then we couldn't have a conversation about enslaved Americans moving from one place to another. So I personally would rather have that conversation with a couple caveats and hedgings than not have it at all, because it's not statistically meaningful. But I got kicked out of architecture school, so it's my perspective.
I'll keep mine short. Most of my work,
Sorry.
No, it's fine. I feel like just my work is pretty, I don't want to say unbiased, but I use the data pretty literally. The thing that I've been critiqued for in sessions like this is, why aren't you showing us it? Why aren't you, for example, the National Center for Supercomputing Applications piece, that was a really interesting public art commission because the scientists who worked in the building were different from the people who were awarding the public art commission. And so I learned after I was awarded the commission that actually, NCSA, it makes sense. These are incredible scientists that have huge supercomputers that are doing a lot of interesting and important calculations. They are the largest energy consumers on campus, for good reason. It was their work, but they didn't really want a numeric value in the animation. They were totally cool with a visual animation that showed the ebbs and flows of the use of the energy, but they were pretty clear with me that we like your work, you don't really use a lot of numeric stuff in your work, but please don't do it here.
Please continue to not use
Please continue your non-didactic approach. So that's an example where even the folks who were going to be living in this building with my work, they didn't really want numbers, you know, and that was, I thought it was really cool that they actually said this. And then I did a piece at the MCA, the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago, where I was mapping the energy of one 20 amp electric circuit. I basically hooked up lamps, as many lamps as I could hook up to a 20 amp circuit, and when they were all turned on, it was just kind of like this, just a blast of light. But the only way to figure out what was going on was to have people turn off all the lamps and see what happened on this screen, and they got this animation of these kinds of nighttime fireflies, these swarming mobs. So when I did an artist talk there, people were like, well, we want to know how many kilowatts of electricity and this and that. And I just said, you know, I wanted the piece to be poetic. You can buy an energy meter for that and stick it in your home. I mean, I'm an artist. This is the way I think. So fidelity in data in my work is important, but it might be a little hard to find numerically.
Well, thanks so much. That's a perfect segue to go see more work like that in the data exhibition. And the artists will be here, so please feel free to come over and introduce yourself and ask them about their work too. Thank you so much.
Thank you.